Thanks, Nandan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Arghya. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. So, I was just looking back at your book, Reimagining India in 2009. It's been a decade since then. What do you think has changed?
Well, I wrote that book in a time of tremendous optimism about what are the possibilities in India. So it's a very optimistic book. Uh, and I think now, while I'm still an optimist, I think I'm a little more guarded optimist because while the trends that I talked about are largely relevant, not everything has panned out the way I had imagined. For example, one of the big things that happened in India was the realization that education is very important, and families began to realize that education was the key to social love and other economic mobility. And so you saw this massive push starting by around 2000 for universal education and so on. But unfortunately, in the last decade, the outcomes have not improved. While enrollments have gone up, kids are in school, the number of them who can read or write or do arithmetic is still as poor as ever.
So India's takeoff was also coterminous, had happened at the same time when there was a global consensus on globalization. So in the last few years, we've seen that there's been a pushback against globalization, whether we take Brexit as an indicator or the rise of Trump. So we'll come back to the India story and education in a minute, but could you also sort of say now where you see globalization, technology, and what role India will play with it?
No, I think definitely there is. We are in an era where globalization does not have the same momentum that it had, and in some instances, actually, it's sort of going back.
Yes.
I think the big era of globalization in the last 40 years was, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Yes.
the rise of the internet,
That's right.
the rise of containerization, which made shipping very easy. China joining the WTO in 2000. So all these were led to a massive era of globalization. And India also started its economic reforms and becoming more global in that period. Except that I think India didn't fully leverage the what globalization could have done.
For instance?
No, I think when you look at the history of the developing countries in Asia, whether it was Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, or China, they essentially started with manufacturing, then growing up the value chain, making more sophisticated products, cars, and so on. And they use that to bring millions of people into better economic living standards. But that era is over, partly because globalization itself is in a bit of a slowdown.
That's right.
Essentially, I think because in the Western countries which promoted globalization earlier, the fruits of globalization didn't really reach everybody, and so inequality went up, and the middle classes began to feel that globalization was not improving the living standard. They were losing jobs and so on. So there was a political backlash on globalization. And so today, India can't follow the metaphor or the model of the other Asian countries because there's no global markets, not as or will not be as open as they used to be.
That's
And
right.
more importantly, manufacturing itself is undergoing dramatic change
Yes.
thanks to automation, robotics, and so on. So the kind of jobs where you could have millions of people making shoes or something, that era is ending.
Yes.
So we have a bigger challenge because of that.
Yes.
So, what is India's model? As in, is it
Yes.
still aspiring to be a global leader, or should we follow a protectionist turn, as we are seeing in some economic policies, like say an e-commerce policy that the government recently
Well,
announced?
I think first of all, I think it's not that we have to continue to invest in globalization because that's still required. I'm just saying that the free pass that many countries had between 1980 and say 2012, that period is over. So it'll be a little more difficult, but we should. It's in our interest to be in a more globalized world because we need to sell our products and services abroad, and we'll be the only young country in an aging world, and therefore Indians can be the people who support global economies, and that requires freer trade and freer migration and so on. So I think it's very much in India's strategic interest to support globalization, except that on the other side, there may be responses.
But I think there's optimism around what was called the demographic dividend. I mean, it's an interesting problem of population in India because in the Cold War era, the problem was India was overpopulated. This was always seen to be a country which would be overrun by too many people. And then, of course, with globalization, with the opening of the markets, the same story was turned around, and our population and our young population was seen to be a dividend for, as it were, a new market to be captured. But I think today, again, one could say that there needs to be some caution given the idea of jobless growth, the idea of the young who are unskilled. So how do you see, if this is the potential, it's not simply a captive market. How do you make, as it were, the young effective and agentive in the new era?
Yeah, so let me just lay out a few things. First is that the model followed by China and so on of using manufacturing and exports, that model is not as accessible to us because of the various changes happening. Automation in manufacturing and the
Yes.
deglobalization efforts, right? So that's there, but it's not as big as it
That's
used to
right.
be. The other thing is that we have the advantage that we have our fertility rates are dropping quite rapidly, and therefore we'll have this huge bump of people in the working age of 15 to 65, which means that that's the time when countries have the best economic growth. So that's the good news. But the fact that we haven't made enough progress on education, and the fact that we're not going to have enough manufacturing jobs,
That's right.
means that we'll have to rethink and reimagine the growth pattern of the future.
Where do
And
you see that going?
yeah,
And
so
is it going to be technology driven or?
yeah, so this again, my point of view, which is that it has to be domestic-led growth because of the fact that you have the challenges on the globalization, and it has to be small company-led growth.
Right.
And expecting a few companies to hire few 100,000 people, I think that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, India is a nation of small entrepreneurs. We have anywhere from 30 to 50 million small businesses. Some of them are involuntary businesses because they can't get jobs. But if those firms become more efficient, they grow, they hire people, then they will create a lot of jobs. So, and the second thing is, I think services will create a lot of jobs. So I think it will shift from export manufacturing and large company model to domestic services small company model.
So you still seem quite optimistic today.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find something to do. No?